There's a moment in every man's life when he realizes the thing he paid for isn't what arrived. Sometimes it's a house, sometimes it's a marriage, sometimes it's a dream he dressed up in numbers and called an investment. But this one is about a horse. Or at least that's what it starts as. A rancher named Cord Briggs spent $4,200 on what a breeder in Santa Fe called the finest Andalusian stallion west of the Mississippi. He had papers. He had photographs. He had a letter with a wax seal on it, for God's sake. The wagon took 11 days to arrive. And when that door swung open in front of 40-some-odd people gathered in the yard of the Briggs Ranch, cowboys, Mexicans, 2 Apache scouts, the preacher's wife, a livestock merchant, and a 9-year-old girl holding a jar of fireflies she'd caught the night before. Nobody said a word. Not once. That silence, that specific chest-deep silence, is what this story is actually about. Because what came out of that wagon wasn't the horse. It was the moment Cord Briggs had to decide who he was. And I was there, I saw every second of it, and I've been writing it down ever since because some things don't leave you. They just move in and start rearranging the furniture. Have since I was 19, when a cavalry sergeant named Dooley told me that the only things worth remembering are the things you bother to write down. Dooley died 6 months later from a snake bite to the ankle, which I also wrote down, because it seemed like exactly the kind of irony he would have appreciated. The logbook I was carrying the morning the wagon arrived was my 11th. Brown leather cover, water-stained on the bottom right corner from a river crossing outside Tucson. I'd filled the first 40 pages with weather reports, cattle counts, a list of birds I'd seen that I didn't know the names of, and 3 separate failed attempts at describing a sunset that I eventually gave up on because sunsets don't cooperate with language. I write things down because my memory is terrible. Or maybe because the things I've seen don't feel real until they're on paper. I'm not sure which. Dooley never clarified. The morning in question was a Thursday in late September, 1887. The air had that particular quality it gets in the high desert at the tail end of summer, not yet cold, but no longer warm, something in between that sits in your lungs like a held breath. The ranch was the Briggs Spread, which sat about 12 miles east of a town called Mineral Fork, which itself sat about 40 miles from anything worth mentioning. It was large country, open. The kind of land that makes a man feel both free and very small simultaneously, which is probably what draws certain personalities to it and drives others to drink. I've been working for Cord Briggs going on 3 years at that point. Ranch hand, which is a title that covers about 90 different jobs depending on what's broken and who's unavailable. I'd fixed fence line, delivered calves in the middle of the night, chased a loose bull through a wheat field for 2 hours, and once spent an entire afternoon untangling a mule from a barbed wire situation that I cannot fully explain and would not try to. It was good work. It paid reasonably. Cord Briggs was not an unreasonable man. That last part requires some clarification. Cord Briggs was not unreasonable in the way that a stone wall is not unreasonable. It doesn't hate you. It doesn't move against you out of spite. It simply is what it is, and if you walk into it, that's on you for not accounting for the wall. He was 51 years old that September, built like something that had been carved rather than born, with a face so weathered it looked like old saddle leather left in the sun for a decade. He didn't waste words, didn't waste movement. He was the kind of man who, when something needed doing, did it without commentary, and when something couldn't be done, he'd stand and look at it a long time before deciding what to do instead. He had a reputation in the county, not a flashy one, more like a bedrock kind of reputation, the type that builds slowly and holds weight. Ranchers respected him because he was fair in his dealings. Cowboys respected him because he worked harder than any of them and never made a point of it. The Apache scouts, and there were 2 who came through the property semi-regularly, men named Nando and a quieter one who I knew only as Silverthorne, respected him for reasons I didn't fully understand yet, though I was starting to. What Cord Briggs was not good at was knowing when he'd been fooled. This is not a criticism. It's a specific kind of blindness that often comes with a specific kind of pride, and Cord had that pride in spades. It wasn't arrogance. It was more like he had a framework for the world, an internal accounting system. In that system, a man who produced papers, who offered a handshake, who spoke in a measured and professional tone was a man whose word was worth something. Because that's how Cord operated. so he assumed it was how others operated too. He was wrong about Marcus Feld. Marcus Feld was a horse breeder out of Santa Fe who had, by all accounts I later pieced together, been running variations of the same operation for going on 7 years. He found men with money and ambition and a certain hunger for quality, men who wanted the best, who believed the best was something you could purchase if you just paid enough, and he sold them that belief. The horses he sold weren't always fraudulent. Sometimes they were just oversold. Described in language that was technically accurate but emotionally misleading. A horse might be of Andalusian lineage, because its grandfather on one side had some Andalusian blood and a lot of something less impressive. It might be competition-trained, because it had been walked through an obstacle course once without panicking. The letter that arrived at the Briggs Ranch 6 weeks before the Wagon did was a masterpiece of that kind of language. I read it. Cord showed it to me because I was the one who handled the correspondence and kept the records, another aspect of my logbook keeping that had gradually become a professional function. The letter described the Stallion in terms that made me feel something in my chest. 17 hands high, 4 years old. Coat the color of charcoal smoke, bloodline documentation enclosed, disposition described as spirited but responsive, possessing a natural grace uncommon even among his breed. There was the wax seal. There were the papers. There were photographs, actual photographs, which in 1887 still felt slightly miraculous to me, showing a horse that was, genuinely, one of the most beautiful animals I'd ever seen on paper. Strong chest, elegant neck. That particular carriage that Andalusians have, like they're aware they're being watched and have decided to be magnificent about it. $4,200. I didn't say anything when Cord told me the price. I wrote it in my logbook, and I underlined it once, which was my private system for noting things that made me uncomfortable. Cord made the arrangements. The money was sent. The timeline was established. The Wagon would arrive in 11 days, which was an estimate that turned into 11 actual days, which I noted with a certain grim punctuality in my logbook. In those 11 days, something happened that I've thought about many times since. Word got out. I don't know how these things travel in ranching country. There's no telegraph for gossip, no organized system, but news of quality moves on its own current. By the third day, Diego Ruiz, who worked the fence line on the East Quarter and spoke in a mixture of Spanish and English that I found beautiful and could only partially follow, told me he'd heard about the Stallion from a man in town who'd heard from the farrier who'd heard from nobody in particular but knew all the same. By the 5th day, Cord had been stopped twice in Mineral Fork by men asking about it. By the 7th, there was a general understanding in the surrounding area that something significant was arriving at the Briggs spread, and that it might be worth seeing. This was not unusual for horse country. A fine stallion was an event. A stallion of that described caliber was a conversation piece, a point of local pride by proximity, a small collective excitement in a landscape that didn't offer many spectacles. People wanted to see it. Cord, being Cord, didn't discourage this. He wasn't the type to make a show of things, but he understood that a man who had paid that kind of money for that kind of horse was not obligated to hide it. So by the morning of the 11th day, there were people. I counted them in my logbook later. 43 individuals, which is more than I expected and probably more than Cord expected, though he didn't show it. Ranch hands, our own 6, plus maybe 8 or 10 from neighboring spreads who'd ridden over on the pretense of business and stayed for the occasion. Diego and 2 of his cousins who worked over on the Harmon place. A livestock merchant from Mineral Fork named Bo Atchison who had a commercial interest and an even more commercial smile. The preacher's wife, Mrs. Elva Donahue, who I'd always suspected had a genuine love for horses beneath her considerably formal exterior, and who had driven her own buggy out without the preacher, which told you something about priorities. 2 younger cowboys I didn't know by name who'd heard through the regional telegraph of gossip and come to see. The 9-year-old girl, that was Lily Briggs, Cord's granddaughter, who was visiting from her parents' place in Colorado and who had taken a powerful interest in the proceedings, and had spent the previous evening catching fireflies in a jar, which she was still carrying, though several of the fireflies appeared to have died, which she seemed unbothered by. And then there were Nando and Silverthorne. The 2 Apache scouts were not people I'd have predicted to be there, and yet looking back, I wonder if they knew something already. Nando was the more vocal of the 2, a man in his mid-40s with a face that processed information in a way I could never quite decode, quick and still simultaneously. Silverthorne was maybe 10 years older, and he mostly communicated through a series of minimal expressions that I'd been trying to translate for going on 2 years with limited success. They'd arrived at the ranch the previous evening on separate business, something about a map and a water source and an arrangement Cord had with the territorial authority, and they'd stayed, which wasn't unusual. Cord maintained a standing welcome. Food, water, a fire if they needed it. No questions. They stood together at the back edge of the gathered crowd, apart from everyone else in the way that men stand apart when they've chosen to observe rather than participate. I stood near the side of the barn with my logbook open, because I always had my logbook open, and because standing near the side of the barn gave me a clear sightline without requiring me to be in the middle of things, which I preferred. My quirk, if you're looking for it. I touch the logbook's spine with my thumb when I'm anxious. I did this approximately 40 times that morning, which tells you something about my state of mind. The wagon arrived at 9:15. It came up the main track with 2 drivers, men I didn't recognize, hired transport from Santa Fe, and a large enclosed wagon of the kind used for transporting significant horses, with side ventilation slats and a reinforced rear door. You could hear hooves from inside. Movement. The wagon shifted slightly with the weight distribution, which I noted was not the kind of shifting you'd expect from a single large horse, but could be explained by road movement and the horse repositioning. I wrote that down, I don't know why. Instinct, maybe. The wagon stopped in front of the barn, which put it in front of approximately 43 people, which I could see made the drivers momentarily uncomfortable in the way that people get uncomfortable when they've been expecting a routine delivery and walked into an audience. The lead driver, older man, thick beard, didn't introduce himself, looked at Cord. Cord looked at the wagon. Nobody spoke. Cord walked forward. He had that walk he had, unhurried, deliberate, not slow exactly, but measured. Like each step was a decision he was making consciously. He went to the front of the wagon, spoke briefly to the drivers in a voice too low to carry, and then moved to the rear door. He reached for the latch. And here is the thing I need you to understand about what happened next, the thing that I've been trying to find the right words for ever since. The silence that fell over those 43 people was not the silence of people waiting. It was the silence of people who have stopped breathing at the same time without discussing it. It's the specific silence that happens when a crowd collectively senses that something is wrong before any individual in it knows what it is. I touched the spine of my logbook 17 times in the next 4 seconds. I counted later. Cord opened the door. The light fell into the wagon's interior in a long, diagonal morning light, the kind that reveals everything. And what it revealed was not what anyone was expecting. The horse was real. I want to be clear about that. There was an actual horse in that wagon, and it was alive, and it was standing, and it had not died during transport, which for a moment was my specific anxiety. But the horse. It was not 17 hands. It was not charcoal smoke. It was not 4 years old. It was not, by any reasonable interpretation of the word, the Andalusian stallion in the photographs with the wax-sealed documentation. What was in that wagon was a gray horse of perhaps 14 hands, which in horse terms is the difference between a cathedral and a garden shed. It had the general shape of a horse. It had 4 legs and a head and a tail. It was not injured, and it was not sick, not visibly. It was, by the standards of a reasonably good horse at a county fair, an acceptable animal. It was not $4,200. It was not a fraction of that. It was not the photograph. It was not the papers. Cord stood with one hand on the open wagon door. And 43 people said absolutely nothing. I know that silence. I've heard crowds go quiet before, at funerals, at accidents, at moments of collective shock. But this silence had a texture to it that was different. It wasn't horror. It wasn't laughter. It was something more complicated and harder to name, something that lives in the space between a man's public dignity and his private devastation, and the audience suddenly realizing they're standing in that space without having been invited and not knowing how to leave. Lily Briggs, the 9-year-old, held up her Firefly jar and looked at the horse. "He's smaller than the pictures," she said, with the specific accuracy of a child who has not yet learned that some truths require timing. Cord didn't move. I wrote smaller than the pictures in my logbook and underlined it 3 times, which is my notation for things I know I'll still be thinking about when I'm old. The livestock merchant, Bo Atchison, made a sound in his throat that might have been sympathy or might have been suppressed laughter, and I made a private note to dislike him more than I already did. Diego Ruiz looked at the ground. Mrs. Donahue, the preacher's wife, closed her eyes briefly and then opened them with the expression of a woman who has seen a great deal of human difficulty in her time and has made her peace with it while still being saddened by it. Silverthorne, at the back of the crowd, said something quiet to Nando. I was not close enough to hear it. Nando's expression shifted by a fraction, and then they both looked at Cord, and then they looked at each other again in a way I couldn't read. Cord's hand came off the wagon door. He turned around. 43 people were looking at him, and he looked back at all of them with a face that told me almost nothing, which is to say it told me everything. Because Cord Briggs's face told you nothing when he was working very hard at something internal. When the situation was simple, his face was relaxed. When it was difficult, it went blank in a particular way, not empty, but locked. A door that wasn't opening yet because what was on the other side needed a moment. He looked at the drivers. "You want to tell me something?" he said. His voice was even, not quiet, not loud, just even in the way that very contained anger sounds even. The lead driver, the bearded one, had the look of a man who had been paid to do a job and had completed the job and was hoping the rest of this was not going to become his problem, which is a specific kind of cowardice I've seen before. He said something about the papers being in order, about what was described being accurate to his knowledge, about the business being with Marcus Feld and not with him personally. Cord listened to this. Then he said, "You drove this wagon 11 days from Santa Fe." The driver confirmed this. "And in 11 days, Cord said, you didn't look in the wagon." The driver started to say something about it not being his place. "You looked," Cord said. "Men always look." The driver stopped talking. 43 people were very still. I wrote "men always look" in my logbook, and then sat with it for a moment, because it seemed like the kind of observation that had been true for a long time before this specific morning. What I expected Cord to do next, and I'd been watching him for 3 years, so my expectations had some basis, was to send the wagon back, or to pay the drivers to take a message to Marcus Feld that was specifically worded, or to ride to Santa Fe himself, which he was absolutely the kind of man who would do. I realize now, constructed an entire mental sequence of probable Cord Briggs responses that were all premised on the assumption that his response would be outward-facing. That the next move was external. That the machinery of his reaction would produce motion directed at Marcus Feld, and the injustice of this situation, and the resolution thereof. I was wrong. Cord looked at the horse. The small gray horse in the wagon looked back at him from the elevated cargo space with the expression horses have when they're assessing a new human, cautious, neutral waiting. And Cord Briggs did something I have been turning over in my mind for the years since, something I've described to exactly 4 people and written about approximately 30 times without ever fully landing on what it meant. He held out his hand, palm up, the way you'd offer something to an animal that didn't know if you were safe yet. The gray horse dropped its nose and sniffed his palm. And Cord stood there and let it. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The silence had changed by this point from the sharp electric kind into something slower and deeper, the way a river looks different from the outside once the rapid section is passed and the water flattens out and you realize the current is still moving, just differently. I don't know what Cord decided in that moment. I'm not sure he decided anything. Some of the things that matter most don't happen in decision. They happen in the part below decisions, the part that acts before the thinking catches up. But I know what he did next. He looked back at the crowd, at Atchison with his merchant's expression, at Diego with his eyes still on the ground, at Mrs. Donahue who'd lifted her chin slightly, at his granddaughter with her jar of mostly dead fireflies, at Nando and Silverthorne at the back, both of them watching him with an attention that felt, even at a distance, like something more than curiosity. And he said to nobody in particular and everyone simultaneously, "Somebody get this horse some water. It's been a long 11 days. That was it. That was the whole response. And here is where I want to stop and make you sit with something, the way I had to sit with it. The crowd dispersed. People moved. Diego went to get water. 2 of the hands helped guide the horse down from the wagon, which took some doing because it was cautious about the ramp. Atchison made his excuses and left, which I noted in my logbook without commentary. Mrs. Donahue stayed, and at some point she produced an apple from somewhere in the folds of her dress, because of course she did. Lily Briggs stood at the horse's shoulder and touched its coat with the careful reverence of a child who understood something was significant without knowing precisely what. I stood near the barn wall and wrote everything down. The drivers left within the hour. Cord didn't stop them. He didn't send a message with them. He didn't threaten, didn't raise his voice, didn't perform any of the external responses the situation was clearly calling for. Later that afternoon, when most everyone had gone and the ranch was quiet again, and the gray horse was standing in the paddock eating hay with the focused determination of an animal that had been in a wagon for 11 days and was extremely ready to eat hay, I found Cord leaning on the paddock fence. I stood next to him. I had my logbook. I was touching the spine. "You going to go after Feld?" I asked. He didn't answer immediately. With Cord, that meant he was still deciding whether the question deserved an answer. Eventually, he said, "What about now?" He looked at the horse. "Now," he said, "I'm looking at a horse that didn't do anything wrong." I wrote that down. Then I asked the question I'd been holding since the wagon door opened. "Does it bother you that people saw?" He turned his head and looked at me with the specific expression he used when I'd said something that surprised him, which was rare enough to be notable. "Amos," he said, "everybody in that yard got fooled by something at some point. They're not looking at what I lost. They're looking at what I do next." I underlined that 4 times. 4 times is my notation for things I don't fully understand yet, but know I will someday. The sun was going west, and the light was going orange over the high desert, which I'd given up trying to describe in words but never stopped looking at. The gray horse finished a mouthful of hay and looked up at us over the fence with an expression that was, I decided, fundamentally unbothered. I named him in my logbook that evening. Cord hadn't named him, nobody had, but I needed something to call him in the record. I wrote the gray, arrived September 1887, smaller than the pictures, currently eating. The 3 fireflies that had survived in Lily's jar were still alive the next morning. She let them go outside the paddock fence. I watched them go. 3 days after the wagon arrived, Nando came to find me. I was at the fence line on the south quarter, doing an inventory of a post section that had been worrying me since the last dry wind. When the ground shrinks and the posts shift, and you find out which ones were set with conviction and which ones were set with hope. I was writing down which posts needed replacement, and which needed resetting and which were fine, which is to say I was doing something useful while also occupying my hands so my mind could keep working on the things I'd been thinking about since the wagon, which were considerable. Nando appeared from the direction of the creek bed, which is how he usually appeared, from somewhere that made you wonder how long he'd been nearby before you noticed him. He had that quality, not sneaking, just a kind of presence that didn't announce itself the way most people's presence does. He walked up to the fence I was inventorying, leaned on a post I'd already marked for replacement, and looked at me. "Your fence is bad here," he said. "I know. I'm writing it down." "Writing it doesn't fix it." "No," I said, "but I fix things better when I've written them down first." He considered this without judgment, and then looked out toward the paddock where the gray was visible, a pale shape against the yellow-brown of the autumn grass, moving slowly along the paddock's inner perimeter in the way horses do when they're thinking something over. "The horse," Nando said. "What about it?" "Silverthorne wants to look at it." Cord said yes. I hadn't known about this conversation, which meant it had happened somewhere I wasn't, which happened more often than I liked because I could not be everywhere simultaneously despite a persistent ambition to try. I noted this in my logbook, conversation I wasn't there for. "Why does Silverthorne want to look at the horse?" I asked. Nando looked at me with the expression he used when the question I'd asked had an answer that should have been obvious. "Because of what it is," he said. I waited because with Nando, pushing produced less information than waiting. "Come," he said, and started walking toward the paddock, which I took as the extent of the elaboration I was getting. We walked back across the dry yellow field with the sun coming from the east still, the morning not yet gone to midday. The ranch was quiet in the specific way it gets after a commotion has passed, Not peaceful exactly, more like the quiet of held breath slowly releasing. The last of the neighboring hands had left the previous afternoon. The livestock merchant hadn't come back. It was just the ranch again, its own rhythms reasserting. Cord was at the paddock fence. Silverthorne was already there, standing inside the fence line, which surprised me because I hadn't seen anyone go in, which meant either he'd gone in before I arrived or he moved more quietly than I'd accounted for, which was saying something. The gray was at the far end of the paddock, watching Silverthorne from a distance of maybe 30 feet. Not panicked, not approaching, just watching. Silverthorne was standing still. His hands were at his sides. He was looking at the horse. That was it. That was what was happening. A man standing still and a horse watching him, and nothing else occurring for what turned out to be nearly 4 minutes, which I know because I started counting in my head after the second minute, because the patience involved was making me restless. Cord glanced at me when I came up to the fence. He didn't say anything. Neither did I. Whatever this was, it wasn't ours to interrupt. At some point in the 4th minute, the gray moved. Not dramatically, not a trot or a charge. Just a slow, deliberate walk from the far end of the paddock toward the center, ears relaxed, head neither high nor low. Just moving, just choosing to move in the direction of the still man. It stopped about 10 feet away, considered, then moved another 5 feet and stopped again. Silverthorne still hadn't moved his hands. The gray dropped its nose and grazed for a moment, actual grazing, unbothered, and then lifted its head and looked at Silverthorne from a distance of maybe 4 feet with an expression that I can only describe as settled. Then it took the last 4 steps and put its nose on Silverthorne's shoulder. Silverthorne raised one hand very slowly and put it on the horse's neck. Not the dramatic horse whisperer gesture you see in performance, just a hand on a neck, like he was feeling something he wanted to confirm. He stood like that for another minute, then he came to the fence. His face, when he arrived at the fence, was doing something I'd never seen it do before, which is that it was doing something at all. Silverthorne's face was, in my 2 years of observing it, approximately as expressive as granite. But there was something in it now, not emotion exactly, more like recognition. The look of a man who has confirmed something he already knew. He spoke to Nando in their language. Nando listened. Then Nando looked at Cord. "He says the horse is fine," Nando said. Cord waited because he'd been around Nando long enough to know that fine was a beginning, not a conclusion. "He says the horse is not what the papers said," Nando continued, "but it is not a lesser thing. Different. The horse comes from the mountain line, the smaller ones, the ones bred for high terrain and difficult footing. They don't look like the valley horses. But they are made for harder work." Cord looked at the gray, who had returned to the far end of the paddock and was eating hay again with focused contentment. "Mountain line," Cord said. Nando spoke to Silverthorne again. Silverthorne answered briefly. "He says," Nando said, "that whoever sold you the big horse's papers on a mountain horse probably didn't know the difference, or didn't care, but the horse didn't lie to you. The horse is exactly what it is." I wrote this down in my logbook immediately because it was the most precise thing I'd heard in 3 days, and I needed it on paper before it got away from me. The horse didn't lie to you. The horse is exactly what it is. Cord was quiet for a long time. I watched him looking at the horse with the blank-locked face. That meant he was working something out in a place none of us could see. Then he said, "What's the mountain line good for?" Nando asked. Silverthorne's answer was longer this time, a sentence and a half, which by his standards was a speech. "Endurance," Nando said. "Bad terrain, long days. He says that horse will still be moving when a valley horse is finished." "Useful," Cord said. "Yes," Nando said, "if you know what you have." Cord looked at the horse a moment longer. Then he pushed off the fence and walked back toward the barn. He didn't say anything else. But his walk was different from the walk of the previous 3 days, the lockdown, compressed walk of a man managing something difficult. This was more like the walk I recognized, measured, deliberate, going somewhere. I stayed at the fence with Nando, while Silverthorne walked away in the direction of the creek bed by which he'd arrived. "Did he really know all that just from standing there?" I asked. Nando looked at me. "You write things in your book," he said. "He reads things in the animal, different books." I wrote that down too. What followed was, I think, the part of this story that's hardest to explain, because the hardest things to explain are the ones that happen without anyone saying they're happening. In the days after Silverthorne's assessment, Cord began working the gray. Not dramatically, not in the way a man with something to prove works an animal, with the harshness of a bruised ego looking for somewhere to land. It was quiet work, patient work, the kind of work you do when you've revised your understanding of a situation and decided to start from the revised understanding rather than the original expectation. He rode the horse on the second morning. I watched from the fence. The gray was uncertain at first. A new rider in a new place is a lot of new variables for an animal that's been in a wagon for 11 days, but it didn't fight. It moved through the uncertainty the way Silverthorne said it would, with a kind of steady negotiation, trying things out, adjusting. Cord rode without hurry, no commands he didn't need to give, no pressure he didn't need to apply. By the afternoon of the second day, the horse was moving with him. I wrote day 2. Cord is learning the horse, or the horse is learning Cord, possibly both. On the third morning, something happened that I need to describe carefully because it involves Lily Briggs, who was still visiting. And Lily Briggs has a way of being at the center of things without being the center of them, which is a particular talent of certain children. She'd been watching the paddock work every morning from the same spot, a wooden crate turned upside down next to the paddock fence, which gave her an extra foot of height, and which she'd clearly dragged there herself and was not going to move under any circumstances. She watched with the focused intensity of a child who is learning something that nobody has decided to teach her. On the third morning, she brought a carrot. This is not notable. Children bring carrots to horses. It's a well-established tradition. But the specific way she offered it, she held it flat on her open palm, the way Cord had held his hand out to the horse the morning it arrived, and I realized she'd been watching that and had filed it away and was now using it. The gray came to the fence immediately, which it hadn't done for her in the previous 2 days. It took the carrot. Lily stood absolutely still through this with a composure that seemed, honestly, beyond her years, and when it was done she exhaled slowly and said, to the horse specifically, "See, you can trust me." I wrote that down, and then sat with it longer than I usually sit with things. Because there it was, that word, trust, which is the real subject of everything that had happened since the wagon door opened. Not fraud, not money, not horses, trust, who had it, who broke it, how you rebuild your relationship with it once it's been violated. I've known men who, after being cheated, never fully trusted again. Not in a dramatic, declared way, they didn't make speeches about it. They just quietly rebuilt their world with smaller borders, fewer things they were willing to extend themselves for, fewer moments of open-palm vulnerability. And the borders kept getting smaller, year by year, until the man inside them was safe, but also approximately the size of a room he'd chosen never to leave. I've always been afraid of becoming that. I think about it sometimes. The logbook is part of it, maybe. If I write things down, I can revisit them. I can see that a thing happened and I survived it. I can see that other things happened too, good ones, unexpected ones, ones that didn't fit the pattern of the bad one. The logbook is in some ways evidence against the smaller borders. Evidence that the world remains larger and stranger and more interesting than whatever specific disaster I'm currently using to measure it. But evidence doesn't always convince a person. Sometimes a person needs something else. What Cord needed, I think, and this is speculation, not something he ever said directly, because Cord Briggs did not do directly what he could do obliquely, was to find out whether the situation he was in was actually as bad as it looked or whether he'd been measuring it with the wrong instrument. Silverthorne had offered one instrument. The horse is exactly what it is. Lily had offered another, you can trust me. What came next was less deliberate, less organized, more like something that happens in good ranching country when a man puts his head down and does the work, which is that the work starts telling you things. On the 4th day after the wagon, Cord took the gray out on the south quarter fence line. Not a display ride. Work. He needed to inspect fence in the section I'd identified, which required moving through uneven terrain, dry creek beds, rocky slopes, the places where the land doesn't cooperate with straight lines. I went with him not because he asked, because I wanted to see. The gray moved through that terrain the way water moves through a landscape, finding the path, adjusting the angle, never fighting the ground beneath it. On the rocky slopes, it picked its footing with a precision that I hadn't seen from our other horses, which were fine animals but built for speed and the flat. Cord didn't have to guide it through the difficult sections the way you sometimes have to guide a horse that doesn't know difficult ground. The gray navigated. It made decisions. And they were, uniformly, the right decisions. We crossed a dry creek bed that ran diagonal to our path. Cord let the horse choose the crossing point. The gray walked the bank for a moment, considering, and then found a section where the bank was lower and the footing firmer and crossed without drama. I had a horse that went straight for the nearest point and half slid down the bank. "Mountain line," Cord said, not to me exactly, but out loud. "Silverthorn was right," I said. Cord nodded once. We rode in silence for a while. The high desert in late September at midday has a kind of audible quality, the wind through the dry grass, the occasional rockfall sound of a distant slope, the creak of saddle leather. I'm not a man who's comfortable with silence generally, which is probably why I keep the logbook. It's company, in a sense, when I'm alone with my thoughts, and my thoughts are too quiet for comfort. But that particular silence, riding with Cord on that day, was one of the comfortable kinds. He spoke eventually. "I wrote to Feld yesterday," he said. "What did you say?" "What I wanted to say was considerably longer than what I sent," he said. "What I sent was a letter asking him to account for the discrepancy between what was described and what was delivered." "That's very measured." "Yes." "Was the restraint difficult?" He looked over at me. "I've been more measured than I'd like to be since Thursday." "For what it's worth," I said, "I think the restraint has been noticed." He didn't respond to that. "By Nando and Silverthorn," I added. "I don't know if that matters to you." He was quiet for a long moment. Why would it matter to them? "I don't know," I said, "but it does, I can tell." He looked out over the south quarter, the fence line running toward the horizon in a slightly imperfect line. The imperfect ones always held better than the perfectly straight ones, I'd found. Something about how the tension distributed. "Amos," he said, in the tone he used when he was going to say something that cost him something to say. "Yeah. You've been writing everything down." "Always." "What does it say?" "The record." I thought about that. My logbook 11, pages 41 through wherever we currently were. "It says," I told him, "that a man got cheated on Thursday and didn't fall apart in public, which is harder than it looks. And then he found out what he actually had, which turned out to be different from what he expected, but not worse. And then he started working with what he had, which is the part I can't find the right words for yet." Cord looked at the fence line. "Working with what he had," he repeated, like he was testing the phrase. "Yeah. That's not a story about a horse." "No," I said, "I don't think it is." We rode back in the afternoon light that had gone from white to amber, the shadows stretching long across the dry ground. The gray moved under Cord with a steady, unhurried rhythm, and I watched them from slightly behind and wrote nothing, because sometimes you can't write and see at the same time, and on that particular afternoon I chose seeing. On the 7th day after the wagon, Nando came to me again. This time it wasn't at the fence line. It was at the barn, early morning, when I was doing my daily records and drinking coffee that had gone cold while I was distracted by the records. He appeared in the barn door the way he appeared places, without announcement, and sat on a hay bale with the ease of a man who doesn't require invitation. "Silverthorn wants to tell Cord something," he said. "Tell him yourself," I said. "You're here." "I'm the translation," Nando said. "The conversation is not mine." "Why does he need me for this?" Nando looked at my logbook. "He wants a witness, someone who keeps things." I touched the spine of my logbook. "What kind of something does he want to tell him?" "Come," Nando said. This was, I had noted, how most of the important things in my time at the Briggs Ranch had started. Come. We found Cord at the paddock, which was where Cord was most mornings now, with the gray. He'd gotten into the habit of spending the first hour after dawn just being in the paddock, not always riding, not always training. Sometimes just in the same space, letting the horse get used to a human who wasn't in a hurry. Silverthorn was already there. He was standing by the paddock fence, and when we arrived, he spoke to Nando for a longer time than I'd heard him speak before. He was looking at the gray while he spoke, and at Cord intermittently, and at one point at me, which was unusual and slightly disconcerting. When he stopped, Nando translated. He says he has been watching since the wagon came. He wants to tell you what he saw. Cord nodded. He saw a man who paid too much for something that wasn't what he expected, Nando said. He's seen that before. He says the next part is different for different men. Some get angry at the thing they bought. Some get rid of it. Some carry the anger like a weight until it changes their shape. He paused. Silverthorne added something. He says you did something else. You looked at what arrived, not what should have arrived, what arrived. Cord was still. He says the Apache have a word. He's going to say it in our language because the Apache word won't carry in translation. Nando paused, listening. The word is something like a man who finds the right use for a wrong thing. The barn behind us was quiet. Somewhere in the near distance, a mockingbird was working through its catalog of stolen songs. The gray stood at the far end of the paddock with its ears at ease. Cord asked without dramatics, "What's the horse for?" Nando spoke to Silverthorne. Silverthorne answered. He says the horse is for the country you haven't ridden yet, the high ground you've avoided because the other horses couldn't manage it, the far sections, the difficult crossings. He says the big valley horse would have been impressive to look at. The mountain horse will take you places. Cord looked at the horse a long time. Then, why is he telling me this? Nando asked. Silverthorne answered. Something shifted in Nando's expression as he listened, a flicker of something that might have been amusement, might have been something older than that. He says, Nando translated, because the man who knows what he has is more dangerous than the man who has more. Cord let out a slow breath, not a sigh, more like a breath you've been holding for a week. Tell him I'm grateful, Cord said. Nando told him. Silverthorne received this. Then he said something brief. He says, Nando said, don't be grateful yet. Ride the country first. Then be grateful. Silverthorne turned and walked toward the creek. Cord watched him go. Then he looked at me. You write all that down? He asked. I held up the logbook. Good, he said. He went into the paddock. The gray came to him before he was halfway across. I wrote day 7. The horse is for the country he hasn't ridden yet. Then I wrote it again underneath, because some things you need to write twice before they settle. The letter from Marcus Feld arrived on the 14th day. I read it because I read all correspondence, and then I brought it to Cord. It was a masterpiece of the particular art form practiced by men who have done something wrong, and know they're going to be held accountable, and are trying to control the accounting. It expressed concern about the miscommunication regarding the animal's specifications. It referenced the papers, which it noted were accurate to the bloodline if not specifically to the individual horse's characteristics. It offered, in language carefully chosen to avoid the word refund, a partial consideration for any inconvenience experienced by Mr. Briggs in this matter. The partial consideration was $400, 10% of what Cord had paid. I put the letter on the table and waited. Cord read it once, folded it, put it down. He thinks that's enough, I said, because sometimes my function is to say the obvious thing out loud so Cord doesn't have to. He thinks I need the money enough to take it, Cord said. Do you? No. What are you going to do? Cord looked at the folded letter. I'm going to find out what the right number is. Then I'm going to write him a letter that makes it easier for him to pay that number than to explain to a territorial judge why he shouldn't. That's a very specific kind of pressure. I've had 2 weeks to think about it. He picked up the letter and handed it back to me. File it, he said. We'll need it. I filed it in my logbook, folded into the back pages where I kept things I needed to remember but didn't need to see every day. That night before I slept, I wrote the following, which I've gone back to more times than I can count. There is a kind of patience that isn't the same as waiting. It's more like the patience of a man who's already decided what's going to happen and isn't in a hurry about when. Cord Briggs has this. I've been trying to understand if it's something you develop or something you're born with or something a situation beats into you when it turns out you can survive a situation you weren't sure you'd survive. The gray is in the paddock. The letter is in the logbook. The far country is still out there. The far country started about 6 miles east of the ranch's main operation, where the land began to change its mind about being flat. It rose, not dramatically, not the way mountains announce themselves with snow and altitude and the particular hush that comes above the tree line. This was subtler. A gradual elevation that showed in the increase of rock faces, the way the creek beds cut deeper rather than wider, the way the grass thinned and the scrub thickened, and the light seemed to arrive at a different angle even at the same hour. It was the kind of country that punished inattention. You could ride into it on a horse that wasn't built for it and find yourself, 3 hours in a situation where neither retreat nor advance felt safe. Cord had approximately 260 acres back there that he'd never fully worked. Not because he'd ignored it. He'd tried it twice with horses that weren't right for it, and both times had come back with less than he'd gone in with. Once a sprained leg on a good horse, once a half-day lost to a horse that simply refused the terrain past a certain point and had to be led back. He'd noted both attempts without much emotion and concluded that the investment in forcing it wasn't worth the yield, and so the far country had been left to be far. I knew about this because it was in Cord's records, which I maintained. I'd read those records and found the 2 attempts in different years written in Cord's own hand, short entries, factual, no commentary. Just went east, terrain difficult, horse unable to continue, turned back. That was the language of a man who had tried and been stopped, but hadn't decided what to do about being stopped. On the 21st day after the wagon arrived, Cord saddled the gray at 5 in the morning, before the sun was up, and went east. He asked me if I wanted to come. I said yes before he finished the question. We rode in the dark, which sounds dramatic but is actually a particular kind of peaceful, the desert before the heat, when the air has that clarity it only has when it's cooling from the night rather than heating for the day. The gray moved with certainty in the low light in a way our other horses would not have, picking the trail by something other than sight. Cord had brought a lamp but didn't light it. I had my logbook in my saddlebag. I had a canteen. I had the irrational feeling that something was about to be concluded, though I couldn't have said why. We hit the first difficult section around 6, just as the sky was beginning to decide what color it wanted to be. A slope of loose shale that angled down into a dry ravine and then back up the other side. I'd have said, looking at it, that it was passable but uncomfortable, the kind of thing you'd pick your way through carefully on a good horse. Our other horses would have managed it unhappily with tension in the haunches and resistance in the mouth, but managed it. The gray assessed it for about 4 seconds. There's no other word for it. The horse looked at the slope the way you look at a problem you're deciding how to approach, and then moved onto it with a deliberate, careful placement of feet that distributed its weight with each step in a way that was, honestly, close to elegant. No resistance. No tension. Just the specific competence of an animal doing what it was built to do. Cord said nothing, but I saw something shift in his shoulders. We went deeper. The terrain worsened in the way that eastern sections terrain worsens, not in a single dramatic deterioration, but in an accumulation of small escalations. The ravine required a crossing that was tricky in the angle. There was a section of large rock scramble that required more picking and placing than any normal riding. There was a section of loose earth on a lateral slope that you had to angle across carefully or risk sliding. The gray did all of it. Not perfectly, there were moments of recalculation, moments where it tried one footing and adjusted to another. But there were no refusals, no hesitation that came from fear rather than assessment, and the adjustments were smart. They were the adjustments of an animal that had been developed over generations for exactly this problem. 3 hours in, we reached a section I'd seen on Cord's maps, but never in person. A high overlook of sorts, not a peak, not a dramatic vantage, but a flat area of rock shelf at enough elevation that you could see back across the ranch in a way that changed the shape of it. From there, the brig's spread looked like a deliberate thing, laid out with intention, its boundaries making sense in relation to the water sources and the grazing routes and the fence lines that from ground level were just fence lines, and from here were a kind of geometry. Cord stopped there. The gray stood easily, breathing normally, which after the terrain we'd covered was more impressive than it sounds. I got out my logbook and looked back at the ranch spread below us and tried to write what I was seeing, which I'd given up on with sunsets, but decided to try once more with landscapes. I wrote, we can see the whole thing from here, 12 miles of it. The fence lines make sense from here. Everything makes more sense from further away. This is probably a lesson of some kind. Cord was looking out over the far section, not back at the ranch, forward. There's water back there, he said. I knew it from the survey maps, never got to it. How far? Hour, maybe less, now that we know the crossing. That's significant. Significant enough, he said. Water in the far section changes the grazing rotation, changes the cattle management, changes what this land is worth to work. He said it flatly, not triumphantly, like a man who's been working out a math problem and has arrived at an answer that's larger than expected and is still verifying it. All of that, I said, because the horse could manage the terrain. All of that? I touched the spine of my logbook. Silverthorne said the horse is for the country you haven't ridden yet, I said. He did. He was right. Cord looked at the horse, who was at that moment demonstrating its characteristic unbotheredness by investigating a crack in the rock shelf with focused interest. He usually is, Cord said. We found the water an hour later. Not a dramatic discovery, no underground spring bursting from the rock, no vision-like revelation. Just a section of the creek system that had a reliable year-round depth, fed by the elevated terrain above it, and that had simply never been used because nobody had gotten to it. The gray drank from it without ceremony. Cord stood at the bank and looked at it for a long time. You're going to ride this section regularly now, I said, not a question. Yes. And the 260 acres back here become workable. More than workable. He looked upstream, where the creek curved around a rock face. I want to bring Nando and Silverthorne back here, see what else they know about this country that I don't. I wrote that down. I wrote he's asking to learn more. This is a specific kind of man. We rode back in the afternoon, which is to say we rode back in the heat and the long light and the particular fatigue that comes after a morning of meaningful work. The gray moved through the return terrain with the same patience, slower now, because the day was warm and we weren't in a hurry, but steady. Still picking the right line. I rode behind Cord most of the way back, watching the horse move under him, watching the way the horse and the man had started to fit each other in the way that good partnerships fit. Not identically, not without difference, but with a useful alignment that neither of them would have predicted. I thought about Marcus Feld. I thought about the $4,200 and the wax seal and the photographs of a horse that didn't come. I thought about what that money and that expectation had been meant to buy, the status of it, the visible symbol of it, the thing that said in the language of ranching country, here is a man of quality who can afford the finest thing. And I thought about what had actually arrived instead. Not the finest thing, not the symbolic thing, something harder to display and slower to understand. Something that required revision. Something that didn't look like what was promised but moved through hard country like it was built for nothing else. I wrote, there's a version of this story where Cord gets the horse he paid for and everything is fine, and the far country stays far because the valley horse isn't wrong, just insufficient. The version where the fraud happens might be the one where the far country gets opened. I don't know how to think about that yet. I'm putting it in the logbook and leaving it there. The legal matter with Marcus Feld resolved in spring, which is a separate story I'll write sometime when I have sufficient emotional distance from it, which I'm not sure I yet do. What matters here is what happened in the weeks between the ride to the far country and the resolution of the legal matter, because those weeks are the ones I keep returning to. Cord worked the gray every day, not intensively, not with the pressure of a man trying to get maximum utility from an investment. More like the work between people who have found they're useful to each other and are learning the extent of it. He took the horse on routes he'd previously marked as difficult and found which ones it could manage, and which ones needed different solutions, and which ones turned out not to be as difficult as they'd looked from the other side of avoidance. He also, and this matters, began to talk about the gray differently. Not to me, I heard these things secondhand, from Diego, from the hands, from Mrs. Donahue, who came back to the ranch twice more that autumn, always with an apple and always staying longer than she'd said she would. They reported that when people asked Cord about the horse, he didn't lead with the story of being cheated. He didn't perform the narrative of the fraud and the revelation and the unlikely outcome. He just described the horse, what it was good for. Mountain line, he'd say, apparently. Different from what I expected. Turns out I needed different. Diego told me this over coffee one morning with the specific satisfaction of a man who has been watching something quietly and is finally allowed to say what he's been thinking. He's not embarrassed anymore, Diego said. Was he embarrassed before? Men with money who got fooled always embarrassed, Diego said. The embarrassed part was as bad as the cheated part, maybe worse. Now the embarrassed part is, he made a gesture I can only describe as the physical equivalent of dissolving. What changed it? Diego looked at me like I was being deliberately slow. The far country, he said. The horse opened the far country. Now when people see the horse, he doesn't see the fraud. He sees the far country. I wrote this in my logbook and then had to stop and sit with it for several minutes because it was the most clarifying thing anyone had said about any of this. The horse had become something else. In Cord's accounting of it, the horse had stopped being evidence of a thing done to him and become evidence of a thing he had done. The route from one to the other had been, in the end, simpler than I'd expected. He'd looked at what arrived, he'd found out what it was, he'd started working with it. The transformation wasn't dramatic. It didn't announce itself. It happened in the daily work and the morning hours in the paddock and the ride to the far section and the afternoon when Cord had stood at the water source and done the math on what it meant. It was the kind of change that doesn't feel like change when you're inside it and only looks like change from the outside or from sufficient time later. I wrote a lot that autumn, more than any previous logbook. I filled the rest of logbook 11 by November and started logbook 12 on a Tuesday morning with the first frost on the ground. The first line of logbook 12, what I learned from a horse that wasn't the right horse. Nando came by one more time before the winter settled in seriously. He came with Silverthorne, both of them on separate business that nevertheless seemed to synchronize, which I'd noticed was a pattern that appeared accidental and was not. They arrived in the late afternoon when the light was doing the amber thing I'd given up trying to write, and they ate with us and then sat by the fire afterward. This was unusual. Not the eating Cord had the standing invitation. The sitting by the fire afterward, the lingering, was different. Silverthorne, after a long period of his characteristic not speaking, said something to Nando. Nando looked at me. He wants to know what you wrote. About what? I said, though I knew about what. About all of it, the wagon, the horse, the far country. I looked at my logbook. Logbook 12, newly started, and logbook 11 in my saddlebag. I thought about 43 pages of notes and observations and underlined sentences and things written twice because once wasn't enough. He could just tell me to tell him, I said to Nando. I'd tell him. Nando said this to Silverthorne, who responded briefly. He says the asking is part of the respect, Nando said. I sat with that. The asking is part of the respect. I looked at Cord. Cord gave me a minimal nod that said, your call. I thought about what to read. There was too much. I couldn't read all of it. But I could read the parts that were the thing itself, the center of it, the sentences I'd underlined multiple times, the ones I'd gone back to. I read them the part about the first morning. Men always look. I read them the part after Silverthorne's paddock assessment. The horse didn't lie to you. The horse is exactly what it is. I read them the part from the ride to the far country. Everything makes more sense from further away. This is probably a lesson of some kind. And then I read them the last thing I'd written that day, which I hadn't intended to read because I wasn't sure it was finished yet, but which seemed, in the moment, to be the thing. I read there's a version of this story where the fraud is the whole story. Man cheated, man fights back, man wins or loses, end. That's a tighter story, easier to tell. But there's another version where the fraud is just the door. What's on the other side of the door is a horse that can go where other horses can't, and a section of land that was always there but never opened, and a man who found out he could revise his understanding of a situation and keep working. The door is bad. What's on the other side of it is worth writing down. I closed the logbook. Silverthorne was quiet for a moment, then he spoke to Nando. Nando translated. He says this is why you write things down. Yeah, I said, among other reasons. Silverthorne said something else. Nando, he says the man who was cheated and the man who opened the far country, are they the same man? I looked at Cord. Cord looked at the fire. Ask him what he thinks, Cord said to Nando, meaning for Silverthorne. Nando did. Silverthorne's answer was the longest thing I'd ever heard him say. It went on for nearly a minute, and Nando listened without interrupting, and when it was done, Nando sat with it a moment before translating. Then he says no, they're not the same man. The first man knew what he'd paid for. The second man knows what he has. Those are two different kinds of knowing. And a man who knows what he has is, Nando paused, finding the word, harder to move, than a man who knows what he paid for. The fire crackled. I wrote it down immediately, right there, in the firelight, which is difficult but not impossible if you know your own handwriting well enough. A man who knows what he has is harder to move than a man who knows what he paid for. 5 underlines, my personal record. I've never used 5 before or since. The Gray lived at the Briggs Ranch for 11 years. I know this because I was there for most of them and wrote them down. He never grew to 17 hands. He remained the size he was, not small exactly, but scaled to the work rather than to the impression. He never had the visual drama of a fine Andalusian stallion, the kind of horse you take photographs of and put in letters with wax seals. He was a gray horse of a particular mountain lineage, and to someone who didn't know the country he'd opened up, he looked like a reasonably good horse. To someone who did know, and there were more people who knew as the years went on, because the far section of the ranch became known, and its water and its pasture became part of what made the Briggs spread what it was. He looked like what he was. Cord rode him most days when the weather allowed. The far section became a regular part of the grazing rotation. The 260 acres that had been on the maps and off the operational calendar became central. There were good years because of what that land made possible. Marcus Feld, and this I'll say plainly, was eventually brought to account. Not dramatically, not publicly. The territorial process is slow and paperwork-heavy and tends toward resolution rather than spectacle, which is probably appropriate. Cord recovered a portion of what he'd paid, not all of it, and the compromise required took longer than it should have. He filed it in his records as resolved and moved on, which is, I think, the dignified version of what justice looks like in the practical world versus the version we imagine. He didn't talk about it much after. He didn't need to. I want to tell you about the last thing I wrote about the Gray before I eventually left the Briggs Ranch, which I did, in my 5th year, not because anything had gone wrong, but because some movement in a person is the same as a horizon. It exists whether or not you try to reach it, and it's better to try. It was a Sunday in late October, 5 years after the wagon arrived. Cord was out in the paddock in the early morning, same habit he'd started the week the horse arrived. First hour after dawn in the same space, no particular agenda. I was at the fence with my logbook, which was by then logbook 16. Lily Briggs was visiting again. She was 14 now, not 9, and she'd grown in the specific way that children who have been watching and listening carefully grow upward, but also somehow inward, containing more than she showed. She was at the fence next to me. The Gray was at the far end of the paddock. Cord was in the center. The horse crossed to him the same way it always did now, no deliberation, no assessment, just direct, and put its head at his shoulder, which was the habit it had developed and which Cord accommodated without making any particular thing of it. Lily watched this. Then she said, "Does he ever think about the horse he was supposed to get?" I thought about how to answer that. I thought about it for a while. "I don't know," I said finally. "You'd have to ask him." "I won't," she said. "I just wondered." She watched Cord and the horse for another moment. "I think," she said, in the careful way she spoke, the way she'd spoken since she was 9 years old with a carrot in her flat palm, that the horse he was supposed to get would have been fine. But it wouldn't have opened the far section. It wouldn't have, she stopped. Wouldn't have what? She looked at the paddock. I don't know how to say it. Try, I said. I'll write it down if you get it right. She thought for another moment. Then she said, it wouldn't have needed him to be the person he turned out to be. I wrote it down immediately. Lily watched me write it and seemed satisfied, the way a person is satisfied when they've managed to say the exact thing they meant after not being sure they could. We stood at the fence a while longer. The Gray grazed. Cord stood in the morning light, not doing anything in particular, just being in the paddock with the horse he'd gotten instead of the horse he'd paid for. I turned to a new page in logbook 16. At the top, I wrote the date. Below it, I wrote, "Some things that are given to you are already yours. Some things you pay for have to be earned separately. The difference between the two is not always obvious at the moment the wagon door opens. Then I closed the book. The sun was coming up properly by then, the kind of morning light that hit the high desert at a low angle and lit the dry grass like something was burning in the good way. The gray moved through it. Cord moved through it. I watched them for a while longer. Then I went to fix the fence on the south quarter. It still needed doing.